Why do Americans hate knowledge so much? Why are we starting to read books less and less every single year? Well, today, David Foster Wallace is going to speak at length on this issue. And I am so thankful for Wallace because I've been reading him for over 12 years. But if I never discovered his work, I could have been one of those people. I could have fallen off the trail. But once you read Wallace and are awakened by his prose, by the depth that he's able to go, you realize the transformational aspects of literature. And if you love Wallace, I already have a massive playlist of videos on him down below, so go check that out when this video is done. And so this comes from an interview where the interviewer asks Wallace, hey, how did you become so great at literature in a country that doesn't appreciate knowledge? And Wallace responds, quote, I assume that you're born in a place where literature refers to the entire USA, not to the specific region where I was born. If I'm right, then your real question is, how, given most Americans lack interest in literature, does America produce any literary writers? Obviously, one could ask the same question about how many Americans become classical musicians or sculptors, or ballet dancers. It is true that serious art does not interest many Americans to the same degree that it does interest many Europeans. But it's also dangerous to try and characterize a whole nation as a place where people are not very interested, because then, by the question's logic, the only artistic vocations that Americans pursued would be commercial film, television, popular music, and video games. For only these mainstream commercial art forms interest very many people here, which is sad, and for Europeans it may be further evidence of what Philistines Americans are. It is true that serious art does not interest many Americans. Sorry for the repeat, back into the quote, but the USA is also a nation of extraordinary diversity and myriad different cultural interests and enthusiasms. There may be comparatively few living Americans who care enough about serious fiction and poetry to buy books and read and think about literature, but there are enough to just keep literature alive. Just as there are enough to keep classical music alive and ballet, etc. Alive here means available for those who are interested in it. In some respects, the comparatively small audience for serious culture is a good thing. It is true that one cannot become a wealthy or big star in the USA as a dancer or composer or poet. But this means that only those who are truly devoted to these forms will pursue them as a career. Young people who primarily wish to make huge amounts of money or be big celebrities go into film, TV, pop music, or the internet. This situation has certain advantages. Huge amount of monies and fame deform artists, deform art. We have all seen this happen many times to many different musicians and actors who hit it big. And the fact there is no real money or fame in serious culture here helps keep these vocations pure, cleaner. And that's one way to see the situation. In another respect, of course, it's sad and scary. Serious art is where difficult, complex questions get made urgent and human and real. And the political climate in the USA right now is so ugly, unreflective, selfish, jingoistic, and materialistic that serious art has probably never been needed more. But serious art makes people uncomfortable. It is meant to, and a large portion of our populace seems willing to go to great lengths now to avoid being uncomfortable. And we've elected leaders who are weak and short-sighted enough to be willing to exploit that fact. So these are also very dark, frightening times, though you in France hardly need me to tell you that. For serious writers and artists, though, I think that the mainstream neglect and lack of interest is ultimately a good thing. Good for the art, I mean. And so this is obviously a very long quote, so let's take this piece by piece. First of all, I love these Europeans' pompous mindsets toward Americans. And this is obviously reinforced through the Nobel Prize, which is a corrupt institution, because over the last 30 years, only a handful of Americans have won, even though there are people like Cormac McCarthy, Thomas Pynchon, Don DeLillo, and so many others who are now dead. I know Cormac just died last year, but our art form a lot of the time is actually seen as childish when we do want to do it. And so there's obviously a bias here. But one thing I really liked about this quote is that you don't get into writing most of the time to be famous. And a lot of people do. And that's actually one of the gripes I have with fiction is how competitive and meta that it's gotten. And it's ranked very hierarchically. Like when you throw your hat into the fiction ring, you're being compared against all these people, and there's this opportunity for fame and money. But when you throw your hat in the poetry ring, no one really cares. It actually doesn't matter. And there's actually a lot more play involved. People, it's a lot easier to write poetry, and anyone can just write a poem. And, I see this all the time. People send me their poems like, I'm going to be the next great poet. And they send me this thing that I teach ninth graders. Like, my ninth graders are writing better than you, man, which is fine. But it just kind of makes it fun because I can sit and experiment and release poetry books, and I have no pressure on me. That's why I love the whole Japanese and Chinese mindset toward writing. A lot of what poets were doing in the 50s and 60s, they were just writing poems without caring how the audience were perceiving them, because they were writing about things that they knew were important, about nature, about objects, about consciousness, about archetypes, these types of things. And they knew that it wasn't going to be popular, and it wasn't also avant-garde, because a lot of people are like, oh, my mind is too complicated. But what if the things you were talking about weren't liked because people just didn't understand them, didn't learn to appreciate them, but you still made it very simple so that anyone who actually did have an appreciation for that enjoyed it? Like, I want my poetry to be able to be consumed by anyone who just has an enjoyment of nature, even if you haven't read a book in 10 or 20 years. And I think that this quote also kind of underestimated our ability and Americans' drive for money. With the advent of the internet and Kindle and all different types of art forms, and now that independent contracting and courses have come out, the Americans have dominated Europeans and basically the rest of the world in kind of stepping into this digital space and providing different forms of art or teaching people about art. And that's obviously because English is a much more popular language than, for instance, French or German. And so you can translate books. And so if you're a German writer or even a Japanese writer, we can just translate your works. But if you are an American speaker, you have a much broader audience, because a lot of people in Europe also speak English. And the other problem is you can't translate. Well, you're actually going to be able to soon with AI. But if I give this talk, German people who don't understand English aren't going to be able to understand this unless they have subtitles. A lot of the independent art that's coming out, whether it's books or other type of things that involve language, aren't usually big enough to merit translation into the other romantic languages. But to kind of critique American culture, we don't like to confront the real. We don't like to grapple with a lot of these hard questions. And this was my big critique in the video I made on Wendigoon and his whole approach to literature, is that his videos are so popular because when you just summarize something and you don't really go deep into it, you don't have to force people into transformation. What I'm doing here a lot of the time on this channel are calls to action to you guys to engage with literature deeper, to write more, to up your expectations, or lower the pressure on yourself, but be striving higher, to be trying to stand on the shoulders of others and kind of maybe mimic or imitate some of the lifestyle choices or books that these other great authors were reading, so that we can take shortcuts to being as good, if not better, than them. And so in all that, there's a ton of I'm implicitly telling you're going to have to get better time management skills. You're going to have to make these major sacrifices. Maybe your wife or your husband aren't going to like that. Your dog is not going to like that. He's not going to get walked as much. And so, as someone who's been into personal growth my entire life, and I'm sure a lot of you guys know this, when you try to get people into reading or anything new, most people are very closed-minded. Like, I've always wanted, like, there are so many people. I never mentioned meditation before. I've had mostly a daily meditation practice, 300 days a year for 16 years now, since I was in high school. It's just something I do. I've always been doing it. And over 90% of people aren't just not willing to meditate, but are just closed-minded to even the idea. They don't even want to talk about it. And that's slowly changing. But even things like physical fitness, if you go back like 15, 20 years ago, physical fitness in the United States, like on a personal level, if you weren't an athlete, was looked down upon. If you were at the park doing calisthenics or like, weird ring you got the rings on and you're going crazy, or you're like really into it, people would think that's crazy. But now that influencers have told us it's okay, and it's been reaffirmed by deprived males all across the world's need for to view beautiful females' bodies, then and the capital for that's on the back end, fueled by OnlyFans and all of that, and obviously social media advertisements, women getting into it, and then there being this massive male audience who wants to see them doing it, then made it okay for men to be able to do it and be really into it. And now we have this whole fitness culture. But if we, like I said, and so the same thing is going to eventually happen with things like meditation and all these other things, but the bar's always being set higher. Working out and broing out at the gym is not the standard anymore, because you have to be focused. If you're just going and powerlifting and doing the old typical stuff, that's not really awesome anymore, because the bar's been set toward longevity, toward making sure you don't have all these hip replacements. Because when you look at a lot of the older people who have been been working out from the old days, they have bad knees and bad hips, because the methodologies of powerlifting and even bodybuilding aren't something sustainable for most people's bodies over a long period of time. And so the same thing may happen to literature, but the problem with literature is that there's nothing beautiful on the back end. The reason that fitness got over, and a lot of things get over, how did the internet get over? All these things that we like. Well, I hate to say it, but it's because of sexual or pseudo-sexual content online. Same thing with the VCR and DVDs. The distribution of pornographic material is this massive driver that's under the red or the pink elephant in the room that no one really wants to talk about. And with literature, which is involved with language, we can't really get over on that. We can't really use that to our advantage. So we're stuck in this kind of liminal state where we have to ask ourselves, how do we awaken these bros? How do we awaken, for instance, these guys who are maybe open to reading, have read before, maybe read a book or two a year, but make them very interested in education and growth in general? And what's crazy is that the only way that I think it's possible is that if it's the same answer. Females have to get on board on a personal level, not on like a book talk level where everyone's reading books. I guess that could work too, but on a personal level, if women are into reading and into serious literature, then there's going to be an incentive and a sexual one at that for men to be able to get into it. And then eventually they'll realize like, oh wow, this is actually really cool. Like, fitness and stuff. Like a lot of the time men maybe get into fitness for that, but then they fall in love with it. Same thing with yoga. I've been a yoga teacher for 12 years now, and I've known guys who just started yoga because they knew there were a lot of girls there and they thought they were going to get laid or something, even though like no one talks in yoga classes, and it's weird if after a yoga class you're like trying to hit on people. Like it doesn't really work out that way most of the time, but they fell in love with yoga. But it kind of started with that initial incentive. And it's actually why women are so important in society, and strong women, and, who aren't turning into the superficial and artificial women that society is trying to create them into, because they set the standard for men. Instead of women kind of the moniker being, women love a man in uniform. I love a man in uniform. What if women love sculptors? Like, I love a man who has the chisel in his hand or something like that. Then we would have a lot more sculptors out there. Everyone would be a sculptor. I'd be studying the history of sculpture, and I'd have a Rodin tattooed on my arm right here, a portrait of him. And so now when women have, basically equal rights in terms of the laws that are written into the world, they have the mental, spiritual, and physical rights too, to control where a lot of men are going to be headed. And so just kind of philosophizing here, like that is one of the solutions I think, and that's why the whole book talk thing is kind of sad that women are actually reading a lot more now. And there's kind of this revivalism of women reading, but they are reading like very superficial books that aren't going to, and that don't really lead down the pipeline to serious growth. And if men are trying to read like them, if a man goes and picks up, the Love Hypothesis or one of those books, he's not going to end up, reading Infinite Jest or Dune most of the time. Because when we talk about these men, when you think of whatever they are, we want to call them bros or just guys that are getting started just aren't into growth. It's going to be painful. They're going to have to confront all their old demons, everything they've done. It's almost like an AA meeting. Like it's like Bookaholic, like the traumatized anonymous, the non-growth people anonymous. They're going to have to go in there. They're going to have to listen to everyone else who made the journey. And they're going to have to sit there and do the moral inventory and go through the whole thing. And then what's going to drive them to get over this gap? And it doesn't have to all be sexual or involving women. One of the things is happiness. One of the things is enlightenment and knowledge. But interestingly enough, as kind of is being talked about here, it's not really taken seriously in America. In other cultures, where knowledge and people who are knowledgeable are kind of have status in society or are listened to, then that may drive more people. Like, okay, but here, if you become knowledgeable, people start calling you pompous. They start calling you pretentious. When I made the Wendigoon video and said this video sucks because it doesn't ask people to transform. He had an opportunity, and you don't have to, if you have an everyman audience, you could talk to them way above their level and they will follow you if they like you. They will be pulled up by you. People love that. I don't listen to people on podcasts or like in lectures that are less intelligent than me a lot of the time. I'm listening to people who are professors who are really into Cormac McCarthy or really into David Foster Wallace or Heidegger. Mostly I listen to philosophy stuff, and like they're blowing my mind every day. Like they're smarter than I'll ever be able to be. So now I would like to hear your thoughts. Why do you think art is not taken seriously in America? And more importantly, this channel is about solutions. I am always here I don't like to just sit and ruminate on why everybody sucks. I want to come up with practical solutions and start enacting those myself on the channel, start asking you guys to do that. And the one thing I'd like you guys to contemplate today is the role that women have in terms of incentivization of bringing serious art back. And I want you guys to leave some comments down below. I read all the comments, and tell me what you think we need to help people get over this gap, to help them confront their discomfort and move toward growth find real growth, that spiritual and mental growth that so many people resist. So I'll see you guys down in the comments in a second. Peace.